So hello everyone and welcome to CodeBase on the Couch. My name is Vanessa. I'm based up in Aberdeen at One CodeBase. So for those who don't know who or what CodeBase is a, we're kind of a tech cluster and we work with startups kind of all over the UK. And we particularly work in Scotland. We're based in Scotland, so we have 3 sites in Scotland. Edinburgh is our headquarters, Stirling, and recently Aberdeen, which opened last year. So basically the whole point of these CodeBase on the Couch talks is to kind of bring the community together whilst we are in this really weird time, keep everyone connected, and we've covered a massive range of topics so far. So we've been doing this since April time. I can't even remember the time of days anymore. So yeah, we've been doing this since April and we've covered like a lot of topics, from HR topics to zebras and unicorns to funding to, and last month we had data and kind of like data privacy and data transfers to the US. So yeah, we've covered a massive range of topics, and today we have Siwei joining us talking about her journey as a solo entrepreneur. So if you're happy to say to get started and introduce yourself, we can get started with your presentation.
Okay, sounds good. So my name is Siwei, and I'm a founder of a PicoJar, which is a screenshot-based note-taking app. And I have been doing startup-related stuff for almost the last 2 years now. When Vanessa first asked me to do this talk, and I wasn't sure which part of my startup journey so far that's actually worth sharing. Because if you take a snapshot of my company right now, you will notice I have got almost no user, I have no revenue, I have no full-time employee, and I have no office. And so yeah, so I wasn't sure at first, but I do know the one thing I do have after the last 2 years is a really deep understanding of myself. And I think that knowledge allows me to constantly improve my process and update my environment, and to ensure that I can always perform optimally within all the constraints. And there are a lot of constraints when you're working in a startup. And so yeah, so I think today I will talk a little bit about the last 2 years. I probably want to touch very little on PicoJar, but I will talk about this very emotional journey where I launched an app and built it, launched it, and then pivoted to a different app, and the whole everything I have learned throughout that process. And so yeah, so one thing I learned over time is every single snapshot you have in your startup journey, achievement or disappointment, and it's all part of the process, and they're all very volatile and they're all very temporary. And the only constant and the only thing that you actually have control over is you, your mentality, your thought process, your motivation, and your actions. So to give you a little bit of background about myself, so I was born and raised in China. I moved to the US on my own during high school. I ended up having a degree in computer science from University of Washington. And that was never really a plan. Before, I always thought I would be studying art and design, but turned out I was not really good with handling critiques. I didn't like how my professor judges my creation, especially after I pour my heart and soul into something I thought that was special. So halfway through, when I was in uni, I changed my major to study computer science. And I realized it was much more straightforward, and your code either work or it doesn't, and it's all black and white. And so yeah, so I changed my major to that. Soon after, I studied programming, and I realized programming is just another tool that can help you to be creative. And there's so much you can do. And I all of a sudden I started to have a lot of ideas. I almost couldn't keep up. And I was just going through all the old example ideas I worked on, all this half-baked side project during that period of time. And here's one example. And when Flappy Bird was very, very popular, I built this app called Clappy Bird, where you can fly the birds by clapping. And I also built this voice-activated math learning app, and I presented at a startup events while I was in uni, and that was my first encounter with investor and venture capital. And this is one of the apps I was actually quite proud of. It was called Google Idol. It was using Google Hangout to have karaoke session with your friends. And I guess it was pretty creative because I actually had an interview with people from the Google team. And I was just thinking about this, like this could have been pretty useful now, like during lockdown. And so anyway, part of me always know at some point I will work on my own ideas, but I know first I need to be financially independent. So for my first job, I joined Amazon. I was playing a very small role in a humongous corporate machine. And I was learning a lot to begin with, but then life started to become too comfortable almost, and it started to repeat itself. And I was also on a working visa, so by rule, I couldn't own any IP of my side project while I was employed by Amazon. And down the hall, like while I was working there, I saw all these people has been there for 8 years or 10 years. And now looking back, I think I was feeling pretty trapped at that time. And so I was looking for a change. And one day I saw job ads from Skyscanner and in Scotland. And so I applied for the job, and I got an offer, and then I moved to Scotland in a heartbeat. And my friends and my family back then, they didn't really understand, and they were very confused why I chose to do that. And I couldn't really explain, to be honest. Back then, I just told them I was taking a gap year, and if it was a mistake, I would just stay there for 1 year and then go back to the US again. And turn out that gap year become one of the best decisions I have ever made. I was having a lot of fun at Skyscanner, and I also learned a ton from some of the smartest people I ever met. And I was sitting right next to a team of really amazing people, from product owner to the engineer to UX designers. I was observing every single day how the product owner, how he prioritized features, develop hypotheses, run experiments, analyze results, and how our UX designer define user flow, build prototype, interview users. And then I was fully immersed in that process, and I took it out in. And while I was there, I started looking for new side projects again. And I always had this problem with collating travel research. Every time before I go on a trip, I would ask my friends or people on the social network for recommendations. And usually it will send me a list, and I'll have to Google each of the places one by one by copy pasting them to Google Map or Google to look for what exactly the place is. And I usually end up with a list of stars on my Google Map, where I got which gives me no context where I have got the idea from. And so I thought, okay, I need to solve this problem, and I called it Triple, and Triple the traveling hippo. I was really worried at the start that Triple will become another one of my unfinished projects. So I implemented a workflow for myself. And I know it was inevitable that I will at some point get bored or get stuck on a task. And so I always, even though I always working towards one goal for that week or for that month, but I always have multiple tasks in flight, and so that I can switch around if I get bored or get stuck. And I was adding a lot of different type of tasks into the mix, like design or product management. So it keeps keep it interesting and keep me engaged. And that turned out to be a pretty good system for myself. So when I first worked on Triple, I know the problem I wanted to solve, but it wasn't obvious what the solution was. I wanted to build something that people can access anytime, anywhere, so they can capture those fleeting inspiration. So I started out building a website, and then I built a Chrome extension. And every time I build a new iteration, I will show it to my friends or my coworkers and for advice. And subconsciously, I was constantly on the lookout for a better solution. And eventually, I had this light bulb moment, and I thought screenshot is actually a perfect medium that you could use to solve this problem, because it's built into your phone, and so everyone will have access to it. And it captures any app and any website, and it provides all the visual cue that can remind you of why you capture that idea. And also with machine learning and all the technology out there today, you can grab a lot of information from that image, including the text, the location, and all this metadata where you took the image from. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And in August 2018, I decided to apply for this event called TechCrunch Disrupt. And it is one of the biggest events in the startup world, in the tech startup world, I guess. I didn't have much hope to it will go anywhere, because back then I had nothing but a non-working prototype. But surprisingly, it was actually selected by a TechCrunch, and I went to Berlin and to present. Well, I was planning on to go to Berlin to present this at the startup events. So so with all the PR on the horizon, I knew I have to launch the app. Back then I had nothing, nothing really working, but I knew I have to launch the app before the event in October, which was just in 2 months of time. So I turned to my amazing work friends to ask them for help. And to this day, I still couldn't emphasize enough. I can't emphasize enough how grateful I am for all the people who were involved in this journey. And even though I have always been a solo founder, but I was never really alone. My old coworkers from designer, product owner to marketing or engineer, and they were always so kind and so generous with their time, and they were constantly helping me, and they were offering their resource, their support. And with all the help from them, and we managed to launch the app just right before we flew to Berlin. And I remember receiving an email from Apple while I was at the airport. And I went to the gadget store at the airport, and I opened every iPhone there to the Triple's app download page, and I boarded the plane. And TechCrunch was really exciting. It opened up loads of opportunities. And I started to get an email from users from all over the world. And I now think back, I think that's when I realized this amazing feeling when someone thinks your idea, your creation is actually useful. And it didn't really take much to build it, really. Like it just take you. And I was still working full-time at that time. And while I was getting all this PR or user feedback, everything seems great. My ego also started to grow. I thought I had everything figured out, so I left Skyscanner to work on Triple full-time. And I thought now I have all the time I need to build new features. I did have all the time I need to build things, but thinking back, I realized I had little mental space back then to actually think clearly. After left my full-time job, all of a sudden I felt like I had nobody to bounce off ideas with. I have no manager who helped me define my responsibility and set my career goal. I'm extroverted person, but I could go on days without talking to anyone except for my boyfriend. And I was constantly doubting every decision I make. And there was also a problem with my product. I remember back when I was at Skyscanner, I keep hearing people talking about user retention. I never really fully internalized what that means until I start seeing user dropout in the first hand. Essentially, I have this problem, and that is quite common in a startup, or consumer-facing startup world. And it's called leaky bucket problem. It means you have a lot of users downloading your app, but they try it once or twice, and after the novelty worn off, and they just forget about your app, and they never go back to use it again. To build a sustainable business, you really need repeat usage, so you can figure out what your monetization strategy is. And back then, I didn't really have features that make those users to stick around. And all the PR and all the marketing I did to acquire this user essentially become a waste of time. So in other words, people just don't love this app enough. And I really wanted to prove this idea or disprove this idea as soon as possible. So for straight 6 months after I left Skyscanner, I was rushing towards my self-imposed deadline. I wanted to resurrect the app by building more features. I couldn't stop working. I was working day and night. I kept myself busy, so I can ignore the fact that I was actually quite socially isolated. I was also very convinced that I have no time to socialize with other people or do anything else or manage any other of my priorities in life. But in the meantime, I was also less and less convinced that this travel app will actually get me to where I am. I launched the second version and nothing happens. The user retention is still really bad. And that's not just a problem with my app. It's also a problem it also has something to do with the travel market in general. People sometimes come back to the app after 3 or 6 months before they started to plan their next trip. And by then, they have forgot all about how Triple works, and they have to start to learn about it all over again. I wanted to make Triple part of someone's daily and weekly routine, and travel is just this activity that just doesn't happen frequently enough that can actually make this quite novel behavior someone's daily habit. And that 6 months, when I was pushing myself hard, I noticed I didn't really enjoy that process anymore. I no longer felt like there were new ideas coming at me all the time. And that I thought was one of my biggest strengths. And I was just going through the motion. I was doing things that feel comfortable. And I was generally wasn't really happy with my life. I thought I wasted so much time and I accomplished nothing. So I turned to my mentor. I told him maybe I should find a job. I should stop doing startup. And I want to do something that I'm actually good at, and I want to feel that I'm useful again. And he asked me to take some time off and to process my feeling and before making any rash decisions. He said the path to success is not linear, and all the effort I put in is actually investing in myself, and that will compound and that will accumulate, and eventually it will pay back. So I took his advice and I took some time off. And during that time, that 3 weeks breaks, I did a lot of self-reflections and I also did a lot of doodling. So those are things I drew back then during that time. And I learned about mental models, how to simplify things and make better decisions. And I also realized how easy it is to fall prey to all these unconscious biases while you are constantly living under uncertainties. And the more invested you are into a startup, the more you will notice your identity and your self-worth is tightly coupled to the valuation of the startup. And that is a really dangerous place to be. And I think that might not just startup. It could tie to anything that's creative based. And you started to chase after that. You start chase after anything that can give you a sense of certainty, mainly through external validation. And while you were chasing that, it's really easy to go off track and lose focus of what is actually important. And you're always in this desperate need for validation. While I remember being at this accelerator where all we learn is how to get funding. And I think a lot of founders are conditioned to see funding or getting funding as a symbol of success. So you spend hours perfecting your pitch deck and going to pitch events while you have not yet found the right solution to the right problem. My experience working on Triple taught me having an idea is really not enough. The first time when I presented my ideas to my mentor, he actually told me, this is not a product, it's a feature. Back then, I was really frustrated because I thought like he couldn't see my vision and he didn't understand what I have. But now I understood. When you're going from an idea to a product, a light bulb moment will never set you up for success. It's just a start. It is the thousands of little decisions you make afterwards, and that was driven by your insights, your instinct, and which will shape your execution approach, and eventually it takes you to that product. And you hear all this shortened version of success story, and those are just snapshots of people after they have made millions of wrong decisions, and then just never talked about it. And I also realized I need to be mentally and physically secure and healthy to actually have the focus and willpower to take risk. And so during that break, I took a road trip to Isle of Mo, and on my way back, I decided to pivot. And so that's how I came out with PicoJar. And it was no longer about travel, it's more a general screenshot-based app. And I was borrowing a lot of insights and learning I learned from Triple, and I felt like I was given a second chance to fix all the mistakes I had made before. I realized at that time, the most important asset of the business is actually myself, and I need to do whatever I can to actually strengthen my body and my mind. So I started to monitor my emotional state constantly, and whenever I felt like there's something wrong or even a good feeling, I will try to analyze why I felt this way and whether I was influenced by my own biases, and whether I was maybe sometimes I do think just because I was fearful of getting out of my comfort zone. And eventually you will notice a lot of those negative emotions, they dissipate when you actually know exactly what is missing in your life. And I also realized the startup world is this place, though it's exciting and is high risk, high reward, but it's also full of unvalidated theories and survivorship bias. And there isn't really a foolproof way to build a startup. Otherwise, I think the success rate of creating a successful startup wouldn't have been less than 1%. We just need to really understand who we are and what actually motivates us, and create our own processes that can actually unlock our potential. And for me, I think what motivates me is really build something that people want. And when people I don't know who think the app I build is useful, and that's the best reward I can get. So I started picking up my old hobbies again. I started doing volunteer work to feel like I'm still useful. And I went surfing, I went hiking on a weekly basis, while still working 10 hours a day on my startup. And in February this year, I built a prototype of PicoJar, and I put it up on Reddit to get feedback from strangers. And I followed up, I set up call to learn about all these users and what they want. And in April, I received funding from some investors who really believe in me and understand my product. And I see them as part of my team. so now I'm in the process of running experiments and validate all these hypotheses I have. I'm also meeting different people and look for someone who can potentially become the employee number one. So just to recap some of the things I learned so far, and some of the things I'm still practicing every day. So this famous composer, he said that to achieve great things, you need a plan and not enough time. And I think a healthy dose of sense of urgency will really push you towards your limit. But you can't just run towards any direction aimlessly. You need a plan and a goal that to help you navigate. But your plan is most likely to be wrong, though. You just have to get comfortable and update your plan and keep going. And you need to have a healthy mind and healthy body. I can't emphasize this enough to sustain through the marathon. I think when you're in the zone and when you're so close to the business, you sometimes lose sight of what is what your body or what your mind actually needs. That's why have a support network. Have somebody who actually understands your value, your ambition. And when you're talking to other people, naturally you will become defensive, because I still do that all the time. But some of the words will linger, and eventually it will become the key to untangle some of the most puzzling problem in your head. And last but not least, reframe your failure. Accept that every single entrepreneur makes hundreds of wrong decisions before they make the right one, but they never gave up. So failure is just another data point, and that provides you new insights and new learning. And it doesn't mean that your conviction or your vision was wrong. You just have to learn from it and keep going. And so yeah, so that's the end of my talk. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Siwei. I hope we really enjoyed that. So we'll do a virtual round of applause for Siwei. Thank you so much for that kind of like honest and really open kind of reflection on your past 2 years. I think maybe some people on the webinar today will be at a certain point that you were at, and maybe really needed this to kind of like pull themselves out and to know that, like you said, you can make mistakes, and to pull yourself out of them, and what you did, you pivoted, and now you're working on something new. So yeah, that was a really inspirational talk. Thank you so much for that, Siwei. Yeah, if anyone has any questions or any comments, please use the chat function or the Q&A box below. We did have a question come through whilst you were talking, Siwei, if you're okay to
Yeah,
it.
of course.
The question says, what activities you planned and implemented to get a sense or estimate of whether your app idea is something that people want, and to what extent? So what activities did you plan and implement to get a sense of whether your app idea is something that people want?
Okay. Yeah, so first of all, I have to say this is something I'm still trying to figure it out myself. I don't think there's a straightforward answer, but I do have a few things I found is kind of useful. First of all is to back up a little bit. So first of all, when you build I guess I don't want to call it startup, or I would call it when you build a product. And I like to build product that start as to solve my own problem. And I found that is really useful, because you are the proxy to millions of users who are similar to you. And when you are solving a problem for yourself, you can always validate it on yourself. If you are not using this app on a daily or weekly basis, you can't expect anyone else to do so. And so I always use myself as a proxy, as the thing to do the experiment. But having said that, like when you're like, once you have something that proves kind of working on you, and you see the potential that might be working on others, and then the first thing you do is to make that hypothesis in your head. And usually you actually make the no hypothesis first. So say, like, if I say I think people would use this app weekly because of this reason, and you make no hypothesis like how would I disprove this? How would I like what happened? I would say this thing is not working. This hypothesis is wrong. And this is actually something I learned from my product owners. So you say, if there's no user coming back on like every 3 days or every 5 days, then that means this hypothesis is not working. And then you think whether that is the right hypothesis, no hypothesis you can make. And then you launch your app, and then you recruit just a small amount of users, and don't try to recruit it on like a public forum where like Product Hunt and that sort of thing, because you will get a lot of users that might not really become the hardcore people who actually understand this problem. You target the very narrow niche group of people and ask them to try this app, and then ask them to give you feedback and really follow up. And because sometimes people will stop using it, but you understand what the reason why they stop using it, but they might have a very different reason. So really drill down to why they stop using it, why they think there should be some other features, and what's exactly the problem they're trying to solve. So this is kind of like some basic process I use to kind of validate an idea. I hope that makes sense.
Well, yeah, hopefully that's answered your question. If not, please feel free to leave another question below. There was something that I kind of really enjoyed from your talk, is that you were looking back on your earlier projects that you did back in the beginning of your career. Is there anything that you wish that you had kind of like kept on with? Was there anything that you're like, I would love to revisit that again someday, or more like percent committed to kind of what you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, I think like say, for example, a lot of those ideas still haven't been done yet, like the karaoke thing. Maybe I could like bring it back again. But you know, people always have this sort of regret. They always say like, oh, I wish I have done this. But you need to, if you put yourself, you need to put things in context. I think they always say youth is wasted on the young. Like back then when I was early 20, I didn't really understand like how to actually carry a project forward, and then how do I actually follow through something. And it really takes years of experience, years of talking to other people and meeting other people, and to actually get to where I am now. So I just think ideas can always get picked up again, but I don't think back then I had the ability to actually launch a startup. I just not in the right place at that time. And so yeah, but I do wanna, like at some point, I always have loads of other ideas. I think if this idea didn't, like PicoJar didn't work, I was just gonna work on something else. But at least I have the process. Yeah.
I think that's kind of like the problem, is the kind of mental battle when you're younger as well. Is that you're quite naive, you don't really know like what's out there. You've got this idea that could be awesome, but yeah, you're right, kind of where do you go with that when you're young? Do people even take you seriously?
Yeah.
So yeah, I really understand that. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, again, feel free to leave them in the Q&A. We're going to be here for another 20 minutes, so we've got lots of time. So there was something else that I really enjoyed about your talk was, you know, from Triple, you decided to quit your full-time job and go and do that full time. So what was kind of the deciding factor for you? What was the whole, like the last, like the straw that broke the camel's back, that's it? What was kind of that pivotal moment where you decided that Triple was what you wanted to do full time?
I said, what I talked about earlier, like ego was definitely part of it. I thought like, okay, I can be a startup founder now. And but also I think I have learned enough. It was all throughout all my career, I was like paving the road towards building a startup eventually. And I was learning different type of things. I was looking for opportunity to learn different type of things. I learned about how a big organization work, how a smaller company work. I was a manager at the end of working at a Skyscanner. And so I learned how to manage people. I learned how to lead a team, how to build features. So I felt like I had learned everything I needed to build a startup. And I was pretty financially stable and have enough saving that allowed me to do this. So I think all these factors contributed to the final decision. And yeah.
So it was kind of like a lots of things that kind of built up into this
Yeah.
goal. We've got a couple of questions coming through. First question says, you mentioned the importance of a peer network. How did you decide which advice to follow and which to ignore?
This is a really good question. I didn't realize how like taking advice is actually something you really need to learn. Because there's so much noise. And I think for me, the general rule of thumb is if someone who have built a startup, who have successfully built a startup or were involved in building a successful startup, and that's usually someone you take advice from. Don't listen to people who there are people who like to give advice. Everyone is going to give you advice. Everyone you talk to is going to say, you should build this, you should build that. Oh, I think you should do that. And but they don't understand that you spend hours and days thinking about this every single day. This is your full-time job. And other people always have opinions on what you should do. And so listen to people who have done this and take time to listen to it, but how would I put this? Think about it, but don't really, don't make it, I guess, well, you're trying to think about, just trying to process every single advice you got and then decide which one worth taking and worth not. And also, I guess, yeah, like sometimes it takes time to actually know which advice that is actually useful. So yeah, so don't just judge like, okay, because I don't like this advice, so I'm not going to take it. Just take time, and then after a few weeks, and when you start looking at problem, and when you start encountering problem, then you're thinking back, and some advice start to make sense. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I hope that's answered your question. If not, please feel free to leave another one. We've got another question come through from Tanya. She asked, what was the deciding factor that made you pivot to PicoJar?
I think, yeah, I kind of mentioned it in the talk. I think, so one of the main reason was the user retention was not really good. And I think that to building a consumer facing app, that's the #1 metrics you need to measure. And a travel app just never gonna give you that much user retention like you wanted, because it's just not a very frequent activity people do. And second, there was a huge technical problem I couldn't solve properly. I think people put a lot of hope into machine learning, and in retrospect, I think machine learning is a novel idea, but if it doesn't really solve a human problem, and it's not really gonna, it's still not gonna like become the deciding factor, and that makes your app succeed. So I think I couldn't solve that technical problem. I felt like I could never deliver the what I really wanted to build. So all in all, and I started thinking about the way I talk about how people have the problem creating travel idea, and that's not just a problem in travel. That's a problem with any type of external inspiration you get on your mobile phone, and it can apply to any type of information, and it's not just for travel inspiration. And so that's why I thought maybe I should like reposition this app in a more horizontal market and then solve a more general problem, so people will use this app more frequently. And so that's kind of why I pivoted to PicoJar.
I hope that's answered your question, Tanya. We've got another question come through. How big of a challenge was it for you to convince the investors about market validation of your product/idea?
I think for a early stage or like pre-seed VC, they usually invest in the founder, not the product. And at first, I didn't really realize that enough. Like I was also trying to convince them, like, okay, I have market. But you know, people make so many pivot when they were building something, and all this successful startup you look at, they all have been through a lot of pivot and change the market. So you do need to have a plan. That's what I mean when I say you need to have a plan, but you need to accept that your plan is probably going to be wrong, and your investor will look at that plan, and they also know that your plan is going to be wrong. So they don't even really care about the forecasting as much as you think, and they really care about is your process, like how you work, and then whether you can really, you have the resiliency to keep going, I think.
Thank you. I hope that's answered your question. We've got a few more come through, so hopefully we'll have time to fit them all in. So another question is, how do you face problems such as Apple or Microsoft add similar function directly into their OS?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest advantage, well, that's the problem. It might happen, but so far it hasn't happened. I wonder why, because it's been like 2 years. I think they should probably start building it. But having worked at a big company, I also know how long it takes for a big company to actually get something like this to build into their system, because they have this whole like somewhat waterfall like process, and then they always have to triage, prioritize. They have to always build things that aligns with their strategy. So so that's why I think my goal, well, as a startup, my advantage is I have the momentum. I can just build something really quickly, and I can pivot really quickly, and so I just gonna take advantage of that and keep going. And ideally, I can start building up the moat, and so that I will have enough, like a fan base almost, and they have enough content saved to the app, and that help me to build up the barrier to exit, so people don't switch this app as much. So I guess you can see that in a lot of consumer apps out there that has taken advantage of that, and like Dropbox, they were competing against Google Drive back then, but because they had a solid user base who have saved enough content, accumulate enough value inside your app, so it's unlikely for them to switch to something else. So hopefully I get there soon enough before Apple and Microsoft start to build similar features.
Thank you so much for that question. That was a really good question. We've got time for a few more. Tanya has another question. You mentioned that you missed having a community to bounce ideas off of when you left Skyscanner. How did you find that community as you progressed with your founder journey? I guess your community, like within Skyscanner, because I think you spoke to a lot of your colleagues in Skyscanner in regards to your products. So I guess, Tanya, I don't know if you want to expand on that.
No, I think I kind of get it. Well, community is so important. I just can't emphasize enough. Like, that's why I'm here. If any of you felt you're lonely, or you felt like you want to talk to somebody, come talk to me, because I want to talk to you guys as well. I still have this problem. I still need to constantly put in effort to create a community. It really helps you to give you mental space to get new perspective. Like sometimes you just need to sit back, to zoom out a bit before you can zoom in again. So that's why it doesn't even have to be people who work in tech. It just needs to be anything that people can give you support, and that people help you realize there's more things in life than a startup. So so back then I didn't understand that. I thought like I can push, I have all the drive, I have all my discipline, I just need to keep going. But now in retrospect, like I think that was a mistake. So yeah, community is definitely important.
Definitely. I hope that's answered your question, Tanya. So Hugo's actually asked a really good question. He says, thanks so much for sharing with your vulnerability. His question is, at what point in your feature journey will you add revenue streams? and he's put in brackets, once you have X number of users or something else.
Yeah, I think I'm constantly evaluating. So I think as soon as I can see there's a sign of repeat usage, like of daily or weekly usage, then I can start adding a lot of like, freemium model or anything that, even some sort of referral or partnership with the other app, and to bring the revenue stream in. But I think right now, thinking about that will add more mental load. So I rather just focusing on get the product to like a really solid product so people can use it like repeatedly, and then I will start thinking about that.
Cool. I hope that's answered your question, Hugo. Got time for a few more. One of the questions says, could you share some experience of how you got in touch with investors?
Just try to talk to people. So my investor I had, I got into touch with them through my mentor. Actually, I don't remember actually exactly, but I was in an accelerator, and one of the investor I met one time while I was at the accelerator, but they weren't interested in Triple back then when I was introduced them to Triple, and I was actually quite frustrated. But I think a lot of time what investors do is they talk to you, and they get a sense of who you are, and they want to spend a lot of time with you and then like observe how you grow over time. So I talked to the investor when I first started Triple, and then I pivoted to a different project, and then I launched a prototype, and I was still talking to them on and off, but there was never a really like a decision whether they would like to invest or not. But at some point, I think after I had some user validation, and they also tried the app, and they kind of liked it, and that's when they say that okay, they would like to invest. So I guess there are tons of opportunity in Edinburgh, and they're just trying to don't make this your full-time job. Don't make looking for investor like the only thing you do. But when you feel pretty confident and then starting to look for investor, and because this community is pretty small, it's pretty intimate, so you can really get to one-on-one session with a lot of investors. And also don't make a lot of investors it's not that they don't respect you, but you kind of felt like they don't really get your product. They were being they're very polite, but they don't really give you a defined answer. So try to ignore that kind of investor, in my opinion, and just trying to talk to people who actually understand you and understand your product.
How involved are investors? Like once you get the funding from investors, like how involved are they in the rest of your kind of journey? Are they quite vocal in terms of what they want to see from you? They want like a return, or what is their kind of involvement?
Not very much. I think that's another reason why I look for the right investor. Because for me, because they really understand me and they know I'm like very controlling founder almost. I really want my product to go towards my vision, and then they believe I have all the skill I needed to come up with that product. So they don't really give me a lot of advice on on like a monthly or weekly basis, and they will check in once in a while and see how things are going, and they give me support if I need it, but they wouldn't like be too involved. And I think that's why looking for investor, and it's not just like investor evaluating you, it's also you're evaluating the investors, and you need to look for the ones that complements you, and then can also like help you to get through all these adversities.
Oh, thank you so much. I hope that's answered the question in regards to the investors. We probably have one more. I think Tanya popped one in the chat. She said, how much market research did you do? When you started interviewing people on Reddit, how long did it take before you felt comfortable that you had done a thorough investigation of the market, or is it really an ongoing process?
I think launch a prototype is the best way to test the market. A lot of time, well, there are a lot of things you need to test. You first need to test if this problem is a valid problem. And that's why sometimes having yourself as the first user is useful, because you can immediately notice whether this is actually a problem. And when you're testing a problem, you don't really have to build something that's super polished. You can have like an MVP, and then when you see how people react to your first MVP, and then you kind of get a sense of how big a problem this is. Because sometimes some problem seems like a problem, but it just doesn't cause enough friction in people's life and to make it actually worthwhile. So validate whether this problem is actually a real problem is the first thing. And once you do that, you start looking for how many people actually have this problem. But a lot of people say you need to build something in a big market. But I think you need to look for a market where people have like really strong need towards this problem. So it doesn't have to be a big market, but it could be very niche. If you know exactly where the users are. And so I think when I was testing on Reddit, I was more looking for the channel as opposed to how big the market is. I was looking for which subreddit is the right group of people that I can actually target, and how big a problem it is for them, and which group of people actually reacted to this problem, like responded to this problem strongly. And so that's what I was testing. And when people start saying, and I did see on metrics, like the people are using this app, like even though it was really basic, it was barely nothing, it was only have like 1 or 2 features, but people were using it on like for like straight 3 months, like every other day. So that's why I thought, okay, this is a pretty good sign of this thing might go somewhere if I start bringing in more useful things.
Thanks for that answer, Siwei. I hope that's answered your question, Tanya. If not, I think we might be able to squeeze another one. I hope I picked up everyone's questions. If not, please feel free to flag them to me. There was quite a few that came through at the same time. But yeah, it's really interesting you say that about kind of like MVPs. I think people struggle with MVPs thinking that it needs to be like perfect before they kind of launch it onto the market. And I think we did an MVP talk a couple of months ago, and when does an MVP stop becoming an MVP? You're just obsessing over a product that you're never going to launch, and you're never going to be able to test your theories or never be able to kind of get feedback on it. So I think that was really really good advice to kind of do the testing and things like that. So thank you to everyone. If you have any last minute questions, we probably have time for one more before we wrap up. But before we finish, I just want to say a big massive thank you to Siwei for this chat. Another virtual round of applause to you. Yeah, I think we all really appreciate the kind of like open and honest kind of talk that you gave in terms of your journey, because I guess not everyone sees that. When you read about founder journeys, it seems very simple, like in your first graphic, seems like a straightforward road, but in reality there's lots of things, and it's so good to hear that you've pivoted and kind of your journey and how you kind of got to that point as well. So I really hope everyone really enjoyed that, and thank you, Siwei, for taking the time out to talk about this with us. And hopefully, are you happy leaving your contact details? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just gonna say that I would love to share my email, and if anyone wanna grab a coffee, have a chat, like feel free to do that. I really want to like get into this community as well.
Yeah, awesome. No worries. Well, what I'll do is, if you're happy, I can share your contact details.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the post-event email. So yeah, if anyone wants to grab a coffee with Siwei and talk a little bit more, I'm sure she'll be happy to sit with you. So yeah, if there's no more questions, I guess we'll just wrap up today. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. We should have another talk in September, so I would keep a lookout on our website for any future CodeBase on the couches, but this is going to be recorded. So if you fancy watching it back again, if you want to pick up a couple of things again, then it'll be on our YouTube channel either by the end of today or tomorrow morning. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.
Okay, bye.